I was thinking, what does the coming out journey look like for you? What does it mean to you to come out?
That's a really tough question. And that will probably be a different answer for whoever, depending on who you'd ask at any given time. What it means to me, I guess it's that acceptance in yourself of who you actually are, and coming to a point where you can live your life without the worry and anxiety around it. I mean, what it means to me is probably just that it's kind of almost like the end of the journey, although obviously once you come out, it's a whole new one begins.
But it never stops.
It never stops, but it's getting to that point where that second phase can happen. So all those worries and, you know, of who am I and what am I feeling? Is this real? Is this a phase? All of those different things. Kind of once you get into that point of accepting it, and then you realize what this is, then you can move on to that second point, which is, you know, telling people and then living your life as a gay person. What does it mean to you?
So that I find, I'm just going to respond to you first. That's really interesting. So it's very much the internal you, isn't it? It's about, as you said, it's about what you're feeling inside, and how you, I suppose, how you then interact with those around you as a result of that process of, and I suppose saying it. Lots of people talk about the coming out process, about being, silly phrases like jumping out of the closet and come screaming out of the closet, or things like that. But they talk about this idea that you want to suddenly be a visible symbol, that it's all about shouting and loads of colours and being dramatic or whatever. All of those stereotypes we hear and often see in programmes in the TV about what it means to come out. But I think you're right. I think it's a lot more personal than that. It's not about a public thing to begin with. It's not about being loud and shouty and proud for everybody to see. It's about you first internally going, do you know what? This is me, and this is who I am, and now I'm going to live that way. And if people ask, a bit like your story we were talking before, when somebody asks you, you can say, yeah, that's me. Yeah, I am. I'm gay. I'm that thing. So I like that idea. I like the internalized idea of it. For me, I think it was very much about self-acceptance first. It was about, I think I was very late in coming out. 23 at university was because it took me a long time for that internalized self-acceptance. I had to come out to myself before I could come out to anybody else. So coming out for me meant, I suppose, freedom from locking yourself away, from being something that you're not. So it was about freeing myself up. Yeah, I think. What's been your best and worst experiences?
I mean, what's the main experience of coming out? Is it the parents, do you think? Is that the main hurdle to get over? Maybe not so for you, because obviously your situation is different with your mother, but
it's interesting you say that, actually. So my mother obviously is a lesbian, so that you think that would make it easier, but she was one of the last people I told, actually, but that goes about having a not necessarily a very positive relationship with my mother anyway. So I think for me to tell her that we were similar in some way, felt I didn't want that. A bit like when you're a kid, you don't want to be seen to be the same as your parents, because that's really uncool. I think for me to admit to my mother that I was gay was like saying to her, look, we've got something in common, and isn't that cool? And I was like, I don't want that. So I don't know, for me, it wasn't the parents. I think the most significant person, I think family does feature. It's got to, isn't it? It's I think for most people, their family are their first core community around them. So it's about how they're going to react to this news. For me, it was my grandfather in particular, but I think it's also about the people you see the most in your life. So at that age, when I was university, obviously it was my colleagues, it was the other students, people in my class, my mates. What about you?
Yeah, kind of similar. I mean, the people you see more would technically be more important, but I think there's always that hanging thing over you until you tell your parents. It's always going to be a worry about them finding out, or if you are going to, we neither of us live at home. When I moved out, it was always, every time you go back, you got those same questions. And it always leads into if you've got a girlfriend, if you're seeing anyone, and that can feel quite pressured after a while. I actually told my parents over the telephone because I just had enough at that point.
Same. I told my mother over the phone as well when I was at uni. maybe not the best way to tell somebody, but it was an easy way of doing so.
Yeah, well, I'd been visiting at Christmas and I'd come back to London because I cut the trip short. I couldn't handle it anymore. It was too stressful. And they called me up saying, like, what's going on? Why did you leave early? You know, and I just came out and said, because my boyfriend's here. And that was it. Bit of silence. They hung up the phone after a while and called back, and things kind of started to slowly build it back from there. But I had got to a point where it was just, I've got to tell them I can't keep doing this.
See, that's interesting as well, isn't it? The fact for both of us, we're telling our parents. So I didn't ever get to tell my father because I wasn't in a relationship with him at all. So it was my brothers who told him in my absence many years after. But my mother, I did, like you, over the phone when I was away at university, and it was when I was in my first proper loving relationship with a boy. And it's so same for you. So I think that's interesting, isn't it? This almost like you've got a reason for telling them. Now it's bigger than just you. Now it's maybe it's because it's the extension of the other person, or maybe it's because you feel more secure because you've got that other person. But either way, that's similar for both of us. It was a similar situation, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, it's like it's one of those topics that always comes up in the group that we run, where they always say, I want to meet someone before I come out. Now, of course, we've both established that's not the worst thing to have, but at the same time, it's a double-edged sword, because how are you going to meet someone really without being out? It's not really the way most people would go about it. You're going to have a much greater chance of meeting someone, having a relationship and so on, if you're out, or at least comfortable being out around people.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then also, if you're introducing your partner to your parents, they're dealing with two bits of information. So they've got the coming outside, my son is gay, also I've got to somehow get on board with this relationship, and he's holding hands with a man and all of these kind of things. So it becomes a bit more of a tricky situation, I think.
There's a lot. I think there's having both having done it in the same way over the phone. I think there's lots of positives as a method, not least because, like what happened in your situation, if the parents need that time out, they can physically, it's not very nice, but they can physically put that phone down, can't they, and take their time. When you do it face to face, it's a lot more intense and a lot harder to kind of escape the intensity of the situation. So for you and for the person you're telling.
Well, I mean, is there a best way to come out? I mean, we both did it over the phone there, but I think we'd both probably agree if you could in person would be better. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I agree. And obviously, definitely, when it's on your terms, I think that it's like if you're asked, like one of the previous conversations we've had, the first person you told was, and a bit like me too, it was somebody kind of questioning you and making you feel like you needed to respond. And that's okay, and it gives you a bit of an impetus to do so. But sometimes you would rather on your terms. I don't know about you, but I would rather know, right, this person's now quite important in my life, and I need to find a way to steer the conversation towards me being able to let them know this piece of important information about myself, rather than it being led by external agency.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you don't want to be in a position where you're kind of forced. You'd like to plan it if you can, but as we've established, it doesn't always necessarily work out that way. And sometimes the circumstances just where it just happens out of the blue. I mean, we've got writing in person. I mean, in this day and age, especially in lockdown, people might not be able to see others. Is there any way you would say to come out in writing, in a text, in a messaging service, an email?
Yeah, emails, blogs. I suppose if with this in this sort of lockdown situation, if you are speaking with your family that you can't see via something like this, via Zoom or something like that, then maybe it's an even better opportunity than the phone, because you can actually see their reaction, not just hear their reaction. So, and you might feel more secure. You might feel more secure because you know you're in your own space, you're in your home, they're in their home, and there's almost like a barrier between you that isn't there, but that barrier can be lifted by you telling them, because you've got this device in front of you which is kind of protecting you.
Yeah, that's probably the downside to just doing it over the phone, because you don't see the reaction, which is kind of an important thing, because as much as you're giving them time to then digest it and get back to you, the body language and how they react, I think just having that complete darkness doesn't make it easy. But yeah, like you said, FaceTime and things like that these days make things so much easier. Wish I had it back then.
Well, yeah, absolutely. The technology, I mean, the way that you can connect with other people, the way that you can realize that you're not alone, and you can make touch with other gay people and have these sorts of conversations is crucial, isn't it? So
it is.
Yeah, I think that modern technology enables you to do things in an easier way, and in a way that actually, if it is a situation that's on your terms, that you can manage better. But I think it's important what you said as well about those spontaneous times when people will ask, and it could be family members, it could be colleagues, it could be someone on the street, it could be anybody that comes in contact with you could suddenly come, are you gay, mate? They could just ask you. And I think it's important during that process, when we go back to the original question, what does coming out mean to you? Like we both established, it's about us coming out to ourselves first internally. Once we've done that process, we're in a different position for then kind of rehearsing in our own minds, well, now how am I going to have this conversation external with somebody else? And somebody off the cuff asking you forces you to respond to that. But if you've already thought about it beforehand, you should feel more comfortable about your own response, I think.
Yeah, it's always good to try and think about how you'd react in those situations. And we've all had it at work, that kind of, there's going to be an out of office event and people will say, are you bringing your girlfriend? I mean, I've always had that. So you always get those sort of tricky moments that if you can kind of plan how you would say and how you'd react, it might make things a bit easier. Hopefully you can just get to the point where you're just fully honest and don't care whatsoever and just come out and say it. But there's all different circumstances where that's not always possible.
I suppose a good way to finish is kind of how you normally finish within the group as well, when you're kind of talking about this topic. But those whole, in the family situations or in the work situations where you're kind of having to prepare for possible questioning about your sexuality or about your relationship status in particular, because people don't tend to talk about your sexuality, they tend to talk about your relationship status, don't they? Let's face it. And it's how to respond to those questions. And what you always say is like, you have to weigh up the balance. Are you at a point in your life when you are tired of lying, tired of finding the excuses or finding a way to get out of being able to having to give any answer at all, or maybe even avoiding going into a situation because you know those questions are going to come at you? And are you tired of that, or is it still something that you can manage and that you're not ready for yet? And only you can decide, can't you? You kind of say that all the time in the group.
Yeah, well, the response that we often get from people is, why do we even need to come out? And that always leads to that. It's like, well, if you go to bed at night, if you go home and you're completely fine, you don't worry about it, it doesn't play on your mind, you don't carry it with you, then fine. You don't need to. It clearly isn't such an issue for you. But for most people, you'll have that slight thing that they're, I wish I said it, or if only I'd done it differently, or, they asked me and I kind of avoided the question. And if you carry it with you and you still think about it, gradually that builds and builds, and before you know it, that's a lot of weight that you're carrying. So it's best if you can to, like you said, plan and have some ideas about how doing it. Start with one or two people who you can trust, people who you see most often, and sort of take it from there. But of course, it can take a long time, and there's no right or wrong way to do it.
No, and I think the message should always be you come out when you're ready, on your terms, because it is your life. I think we always finish the group the same way, don't we? Asking what was your most recent experience of coming out, and since we're kind of having that discussion, it probably fits quite well. So, what about you? What was your most recent experience? Was it pre-lockdown?
I can't even, it's been so long, I can't even remember. And usually I've got a really good answer for it. There's always people at work. For whatever reason, people don't know naturally that I'm gay, and I do have to tell them. Just had my whole life. So yeah, there's always people where it pops up, and you have to do it. And sometimes you do have that sigh, like, here we go again, you know. But I'm very comfortable these days where I can just say it and move on. Whether they believe it or not is another matter. How about you? When was the last time?
So I think, like you, I think we're so far along on our coming out journey. It becomes matter of fact conversation, doesn't it? So but I think it's probably when it comes up naturally. So, for example, work meeting this week via Zoom with my colleagues. My colleagues know I'm gay anyway, but it's just about, sometimes I think it's about normalizing or utilizing, whichever word you prefer to use, the idea that I am in a gay relationship. I do live with another man who just popped behind me a moment ago. I'm sure we saw.
We saw him.
And it's being able to have those in a professional meeting via Zoom with your colleagues, and they're talking about, we're just having a general chit chat about life. Or like in my example, my boyfriend was just in the background making dinner, and he was making a noise, and my colleagues could hear, and they went, "Oh, is Wesley cooking?" And it's kind of like, yeah, that it's those kind of reinforcement. Yeah, I'm going to have dinner now because my boyfriend's ready, and it's a sort of coming out that is just as it should be, a natural coming out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
That's how it should be.
Absolutely.